Welcome, ladies and gents. Chris Andre here. You can find me at BetBoxing on Twitter, or of course, you can subscribe to the channel. Let's talk boxing. As you can see, I've got two very special guests on today. One of them needs no introduction, the chief cappy from Ireland, G-Man himself, the man, the myth, the legend. Welcome, G-Man.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
And our other very special guest today is a published boxing author, someone who I've been wanting to get on the channel for a very long time. So I'm absolutely delighted to have him on, Chris AKERS. Welcome to the channel, Chris.
Hi, it's great to be here, and thanks for the invite.
Thank you for coming on. We're going to talk about a few different boxing topics and talk about some of Chris's work as well, because it is some brilliant work. And one of his works would make a great Christmas present, perhaps, for somebody. So we'll talk about that later. Let's start off, though, with talking about Fury and Chisora. There has been the potential for this fight to go ahead from what we're told now. It is in pole position, according to what most reports are saying. Tyson Fury himself actually came out and said that he believes that Derek Chisora would be an equally difficult fight as Alexander Usyk. He said that he felt the two actually drew the fight, and so as a result of that, he has to take him very seriously. My question is, why is this fight in pole position? We've seen it occur twice. We've seen Tyson Fury win by a country mile in the second fight. Derek Chisora is no longer the fighter he used to be. It doesn't really add much in the way of legacy to his fight. I would have thought maybe you two are going to elaborate on that, whether you agree or disagree. But clearly, there is somewhat of a financial incentive to make the fight happen. But what I want to ask is, if that's the main motivation, why wouldn't he go down the route of someone like Francis Ngannou, for instance? Because from a legacy perspective, you're fighting a UFC champion, MMA fighter. From hardcore boxing fans, that might not be necessarily what we all want to see, but people will talk about it in years to come, and it will generate a lot of money. I'll throw that question first to G-Man. What's your position on this?
Yeah, I actually heard a rumor that the announcement is tomorrow for Chisora versus Fury-3. I just don't get it. I really don't. Like, I mean, like, they've had two fights. Last one was nearly 8 years ago. Well, actually, it will be 8 years ago, come what, November. And I just don't get it. I really, like, I'm scratching my head, man, because it's not like Chisora is looking like he's near the end. And I really don't understand it. Maybe they're trying to sell it as a trilogy fight just to give him, and like Tyson Fury can say, well, I've had a trilogy with Wilder, I've got another trilogy now with Chisora. I really don't know. As you said, why not just take Francis Ngannou if you wanted a big kind of, big event which had a UFC champion involved in it? The casuals would love that. I'm really scratching my head about this one. I really don't understand it.
Well, I mean, one of the fighters that has also thrown his name in the hat is Andy Ruiz Jr. He put up a fan sort of poster about this, and he's spoken about the fight between them two happening. And I can understand why Fury wouldn't want to take a huge risk at the moment in terms of a guy that could potentially turn him over, because he's got the undisputed fight coming up. The thing is with Ruiz, he's Mexican-American, so you'd have the financial incentive, a former world champion, so it would add to legacy as well. And because he's very dangerous for sure, but has slow feet, stylistically, Fury would feel very confident, I would imagine. Chris, what's your take on all of this? Out of all the possible realistic names, we're not going to see a Joyce, we're not going to see a Joshua. Why do you think we're going down this route of Chisora? Is it simply financial? And who would you rather see Tyson Fury fight next?
So for me, it's financial gain for low risk. That's part of the reason, especially because Chisora in his last fight beat Pulev. So it wouldn't surprise me if they use that as a promotional angle, saying that this Pulev, who's a world-class boxer, okay, might be past his best, but I might use that as a way of promoting the fight. So that might be used as a way. I don't know why he's done it. It's very frustrating, especially in the heavyweight division, which is very deep with talent. I mean, why not fight Ruiz? Unless, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a risk, although both Top Rank and PBC have worked together, especially in terms of the Deontay Wilder fight. So there's a relationship there that could easily make that. Why it doesn't happen, I don't know. Me, for the purist, I would like to see him fight someone like a Michael Hunter, but I know that's not realistic because he's too much of a risk, especially with Usyk, possibly fighting Usyk in the first quarter of next year. So is it frustrating? Yes, but I can kind of, as frustrating, he's going to kind of understand it from a promotion side of view, especially because Chisora, whatever you think about him, I think he's like 12 losses now. He's a very good talker. So between the two of them, they could easily promote this fight in a way that maybe Andy Ruiz may not be able to, especially if it's in this country. So is it frustrating? Yes, but from a financial point of view, and even from a commercial kind of point of view, I can understand it.
There was an article that came out from Punch magazine, and this particular newspaper was talking about the financial records of Anthony Joshua. To quote, "The new financial records for Joshua's company, 258 Management, have shown a 35% reduction in turnover from February 2021 through to February 2022. In the financial year leading up to February 2021, Joshua made almost 8.5 million through endorsement deals with the likes of Under Armour, Hugo Boss, and Beats. That figure dropped to almost 5.5 million in the next financial year, meaning the former two-time heavyweight champion saw around a 35% loss in endorsements. Breaking down the numbers, Joshua's biggest loss in revenue came from the non-EU area, as this was reduced by £3.6 million, and in the financial year leading up to 2021 to 1.6 million in February. Now, this was regarding the first Alexander Usyk loss. Having lost the second time, you can imagine the impact furthering. And it's not just in terms of endorsement deals, because in terms of what AJ can now demand for a fight against whoever else, you're going to imagine that it's not going to generate as much money. When you consider these impacts, these financial losses, is this the reason, do you think, that a lot of fighters decide to turn away from risk in the modern game? Chris, in your experience, you've dealt with a lot of fighters in interviews and things like that. You've written a terrific book, The King of the Journeyman, with Peter Buckley, something that I would certainly recommend to a lot of people. He's had 300 amateur fights, been in with the likes of Duke McKenzie, Kell Brook, Acelino Freitas, Lee Selby, world champions. So there's great experiences there. He's had, a really difficult upbringing, a really difficult life. And so it's a fascinating story that he's lived, and it would make, like I said, a brilliant Christmas present. But the point is, you've seen a guy like that and you've dealt with him, you've spoken to him, you've interviewed him, you've gotten to know him. You can see the motive could be different for someone like him compared to someone like Tyson Fury. But do you think it all still always boils down to money, just at a different level? With Fury, you're talking about the tens of millions. With a guy like Buckley, he might have been doing the things he was doing, perhaps to make a living. Or is there more to it than that? Do you think that legacy means a lot more to these guys? What do you think is the main driving factor?
Okay, so in terms of different levels, as you say, Buckley was a journeyman and Tyson Fury is like an elite heavyweight, arguably one of the best pound-for-pound boxers in the world. It does boil down to money, and it boils down to negotiations. So, for example, one of the things I quoted in the book is, with Pete, he was very good at negotiating a fee in terms, especially on later on in his career, in regards to how valuable the fight was, when the fight was held, was it the last minute, who the fight was against, how desperate were the promoters to fill that gap, so to speak. So there's a negotiator in there. Now, the sums of money weren't the same. So you could be like 500 up to 1,500. But there was a negotiation there, and Pete knew how to negotiate because he'd been around the block. I mean, he boxed for over 20 years. So he was very good in regards to negotiating. With Fury, I think a lot of it is down to money as well, and a lot of it is down to legacy. I think the trouble I have is, especially at the elite level, you can have both. If you, for example, are fighting the likes of an Andy Ruiz, an Andy Joshua, Deontay Wilder, yes, if you win the majority of those fights, then the money you can accrue from that could be astronomical as well. So yes, I think it does boil down to money, but also money and legacy aren't mutually exclusive. The two can combine if you're winning the majority of fights against the elite in your division.
G-Man, in terms of that particular point that Chris just made, which is true, you can potentially have both. Is it just a case of a risk versus reward factor? Is it a case of them being afraid to lose their O? If Tyson Fury was to lose, say, to Andy Ruiz, the ramifications could be absolutely huge. Do you think that these things play a role, or do you think they don't cross the minds of these elite fighters like Tyson Fury? He just doesn't believe he can lose.
It's a good question. I think it's risk versus reward is a lot of it. I mean, Tyson Fury, he's always going to be, he always comes out and sells himself as the undefeated lineal heavyweight champion, so he loves mentioning the fact that he's undefeated. And I think that a lot of fighters use that now as a selling routine. When they've got to a certain level, they're always kind of, well, I'm not just the world champion, I'm not just the best, I'm also undefeated, no one beat me. And that's almost used as kind of a selling point for the fighter. They lose that on top of their own. Maybe some of them would feel like, well, I'm not going to be able to pull that. I'm not going to be able to get as much sponsorship off the back of that. So Chris touched on some great points there. I think that it's just, for a lot of it, it's risk versus reward. I mean, like, you know, I would love to see him fight Andy Ruiz. I would love to. I pick him over Andy Ruiz, definitely, handily. Stylistically, Andy Ruiz is tailor-made almost for Fury. But there's a risk there. And it's risk versus reward. And I'm sure for Fury, he's looking at it thinking, to make just as much money fighting Chisora, pretty much no risk. But why would I even bother entertaining Andy Ruiz when I can do the exact same thing with someone like a Derek Chisora and make that money? And a good example would be PBC. If you look at them back in the day, you could have someone like Leo Santa. I think Leo Santa Cruz even said it. Could fight twice in a year against whoever, and make 1 point something million a fight. Or I can fight Gary Russell Jr. and basically make the same in one fight that I could have made in 2 fights. Why would I take the one big risk when I can have 2 fights that I'm guaranteed to win and make the same money?
But the thing is, Tyson Fury has spoken about himself as being the best of all time. If he wants to achieve that, I mean, let's just consider this for a moment. Let's say he was to beat Andy Ruiz, just for argument's sake. Then he was to fight Alexander Usyk, and he was to beat Usyk. I'm a believer that you have to then take on everybody, all the great opponents you had, the great rivals from that day. So he would then go for AJ2. If he then wins that fight as well, you're talking about 3 fights. You're then talking about a legacy, which shows Deontay Wilder 3 times, all away from home. Dillian Whyte, who was a world-level contender, top 5 guy in his prime, again away from home in London. Vladimir Klitschko, away from home in Germany. To then beat Andy Ruiz, former world champion. To then also beat Usyk and AJ. Now you're starting to look at a legacy that was pretty incredible. But when you have Chisora as a trilogy and Wilder as a trilogy, there'll be a lot of guys that will say, well, yeah, but a large chunk of your CV was just 2 guys fighting them multiple times. Isn't there a trade-off there? You're talking about risk versus reward. If his aim is really legacy and to go down as the best of all time, isn't there that sort of trade-off where you're going to say, you know what, stylistically, I know I'm wrong for Andy Ruiz. That's the fight I need to take. Chris, what's your take on that? If you were an advisor to Tyson Fury, you know it's a risk versus reward factor. You might have 5% chance of losing to Chisora. You might have 15, 20% chance of losing to Ruiz. Are you advising him to take that risk? Or are we just looking at it from a fan's perspective and being selfish here?
I would look at it from a fan's perspective and be selfish because I'd want him to fight. But even if I was his manager, stylistically, I say, you're tailor-made. Ruiz tailor-made for you. Why not take that fight? Because yes, he's got fast hands, but his feet are slow as molasses. It'd be a very good fight for Fury to win and actually look impressive in doing so as well. Other people have been like Joseph Parker and Joshua have beaten Ruiz already, and that's a game plan that you could use for Fury. There might be some adjustments because I don't think Fury is quite as fleet of foot as those 2 fighters I've beaten before. But there's ways. I mean, he could still easily beat Ruiz as well in that regard. So I don't understand why, as a manager, you wouldn't take that fight, especially because if he was to beat Ruiz and beat Ruiz impressively, when it then came to the Usyk negotiations, then you put yourself in a much stronger position because you could say, well, hang on a minute, I've beat Ruiz, I've beat Wilder, I've beat always Dillian Whyte, for instance. Who have you beat at heavyweight? You know, Fury always calls Usyk a middleweight. And in a way, if beat Ruiz, that adds not only to his legacy, but also tools in the negotiation table. So me personally, as a fan, I'd like to see the fight. And also as a manager, I'd say, you can beat this person. You may for him, so I would say take it.
That's a fantastic point. And, you know, I actually want to refer to an example, though, as to why we're perhaps seeing this, I guess you could say, tentative approach. I want to point to somebody like George Kambosos. This is a guy who was based in Australia, decided to travel the world and be a road warrior. He fought 2 former world champions in their backyards, beat them both comfortably, and yet they were split decision wins. He then goes on to fight a guy who was in the top 10 pound for pound. He dethroned Lomachenko, and to this day, don't get it twisted, people, Teofimo Lopez is still an elite level fighter and he's a real threat at 140. He went on to beat him. He's involved in perhaps one of the biggest fights of the year, the undisputed lightweight title fight. He loses comfortably. And now people talk about him as though he's a side note. He's got no chance in the rematch. And when I say a side note, it's not just a case of a lot of people think Haney's all wrong for him. You look at Ring Magazine, who I'm a fan of. I think they're brilliant. I think they're great at what they do. There was a and I'm pretty sure it was Ring that created this. I don't know if someone created it and just put the banner at the top, but I'm pretty sure Ring created this little sort of poster or meme or whatever you want to call it. And it was talking about moving forward in the lightweight division. And it was talking about the top guys to look out for. And it had Pitbull in there, but it didn't have Kambosos. And I remember thinking to myself, hold on a sec. We've got a situation here whereby you've got a guy who has achieved an awful lot in the sport. And yes, he's had one very convincing loss. But Pitbull's claim to fame is losing to Tank Davis, who himself hasn't really performed at the highest level. He's a brilliant fighter, but his CV isn't anything to write home about. Something that Devin Haney himself has criticized him about this week. He said Tank Davis doesn't want to fight anybody. Forget, what he said. I think it was an interview behind the gloves. He says, forget about what he talks about. He doesn't want to fight anybody. He's shown that. So when I do beat Kambosos, he said, I'm probably going to look towards Lomachenko. So even his fellow rivals aren't taking him seriously. And Pitbull's claim to fame is that. And because of that close defeat, he's put on that pedestal, whereas because Kambosos had a one-sided defeat, despite what he's gone on to achieve in the past, he's being written off from being one of the top lightweights in the division. Do you guys think, therefore, that the media and fans actually play a big role in the way we interpret defeats? And as a result of that, we're as much to blame because we write off guys that lose fights. G-Man, talk to me.
Definitely. And I think that Kambosos is a prime example. And I think we've all kind of fell victim to that a bit. Well, I certainly kind of have, not necessarily writing them off, but because it was such a convincing defeat, he does kind of tend to go to the back of your mind a little bit. Like, he's having the rematch this weekend. Look, I'm not picking him, but he's game. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if he wins, but I'm not picking him. And I think the media, they can make or break fighters at the end of the day. They really can. Like, if a fighter loses, and, look at the 90s in America, if a fighter, especially in the heavyweight division, lost and was knocked out, oh, he's chinny. Oh, he's not going to do anything. And that affects the fighters mentally. I remember Hatman speaking about Tommy Morrison and how that almost affected him mentally because people were writing about him having no chin and it made him almost worse. So I think the media play a large part in it. They definitely do. Ring Magazine, everything. I think even us online here, when we talk about kind of things, we have a tendency sometimes, I think, to, certainly I've done it in the past, be overly critical. And upon reflection, we could say, actually, do you know what? Kambosos is a great fighter. Just use him as an example. That one loss is not going to define him. He is still dangerous, massively dangerous at 135 pounds. And, him against Pitbull, I mean, I'd be picking Kambosos over him.
Chris, what's your take on all of that? And are we too keen to write off fighters? And how can we reverse that? Because back in the day, it used to be more of a case of fighters would be judged on their big wins, the scalps they claim. When people look at Miguel Cotto's career, they're not going to say, oh, well, he lost to Saddam Ali. They're going to look at the great things that he achieved. Instead, in the modern day, we seem to be leaning more towards that zero. Whereas in the past, you'd look at guys like a Tank Davis and you say hugely talented, but what is he doing? His best win is Pedraza. How do you think we can reverse that, Chris? I know your second book, for instance, that you're working on is to do with the history of boxing in Ghana. And I'm wondering if maybe you've picked up anything from that, what you've learned from that in regards to trying to build up stars. It's not just about, bringing forward guys from the lowest sort of level in life and trying to emancipate them, but trying to create stars. How do we go about doing that, Chris?
So just to go back to a point you made about what happened back in the day, a great example of that is Marvin Hagler. Hagler lost twice before he fought Adam Minter for the world title. Now, in the modern day, no matter how good he is, I can imagine a situation where he would have been written off. I mean, you imagine Roberto Duran with no mass. If that happened today, I mean, gosh, no chance. It just wouldn't happen at all. So this idea of writing people off after a loss is not helpful. I think what doesn't help is that fighters don't fight as regularly anymore. So, for example, most fighters are laid to fight twice a year, and so therefore, especially after a big loss, they won't come back for a year or so because the public have almost, in a way, forgotten about it and want to know what's happening. They can't turn around, have a fight that turns things around very quickly as well. Just to say as well as with Ring Magazine, obviously got their ratings. I'm also a member of a transnational boxing rating board who do the ratings for Boxing News. So imagine with both groups, we'll have discussions about how much is a victory worth, and so on and so forth, and then that determines our ratings. The problem I see with other ratings when I see them on social media is they tend not to be about talent. They're almost like orders of merit based on the value of the fighter, as opposed to the ability and what they've achieved, for instance. Because again, your example of Davies, for instance, Tank Davies, excellent fighter, but then if you were to put him in a top 10, I'd actually put him at the bottom, just because who has he fought, really? Who has he fought? In terms of even, say, super featherweights, like as a lightweight super featherweight going up. So I just think we have to be more critical of fighters and their records, and actually be more honest and not so biased. And you see that even with the heavyweights. I mean, I'm a fan of Deontay Wilder, but I look at who he's fought, and okay, he's fought Ortiz and he's fought Fury, but who else has he fought, really? If you look, compared to someone like AJ, and yet AJ seems to get a lot more stick than Deontay Wilder as well. So I think we as a media, we need to actually be honest and stop being hypocrites, because we'll complain about, oh, people are protecting an unbeaten record, but then the minute someone loses, we're just on their throat saying, how have you lost? And we exaggerate it. So we need to be a bit more constructive with how that loss is, and how it fits into the general picture.
G-Man?
No, I pretty much 100% agree with Chris there. I think when we look at things nowadays, he touched on great subjects there about Marvin Hagler and Roberto Duran. If something like that, if we had a fighter now who was as good as Marvin Hagler, but he came in with 2 losses, even if, you know, we could see the talent was there, straight away we'd be kind of looking at him like, oh, one of my favourite fighters, Gerald McClellan, 2 losses before he won a world title. You know, 2 points decision losses. And nowadays, if you've seen that with a fighter who was even, you know, look, even someone like Tevin Farmer is a good example. Look at him early on in his career. I guarantee you, if he was kind of away from the cameras back then, if you had him near kind of the public eye, a couple of losses, people would have been writing him off. They never would have thought anything of him. I think that we are too critical. I think it's hard to say, right? I think, you know, Chris again touched on a great point that if a fighter takes a loss, a lot of them could take a year off. By then, the public have pretty much forgotten about him. By then, we just kind of, the only memory we have is the loss, and it's all we've had for the last year. Whereas, you know, back in the 90s, even the early 2000s to some extent, you take a loss, you're back out 3 months later, and you're getting back on the horse. And by then, that loss has already been forgotten about, because, all right, onwards and upwards, on to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Kim, the American journalist, who's a bit of a boxing insider, really good at what he does, he speaks about this too. He says it's a plague of the sport, the inactivity of these fighters, and how it almost generates traffic behind the top guys, because everybody sort of gets in line, waiting to get their one shot. They remain inactive, and that affects their reputations too. And going back to the example of Marvin Hagler as well, something else to touch upon is that you don't even necessarily have to lose to be criticized. You look at Marvin Hagler, possibly the best middleweight of all time. He's certainly in the conversation. Some of his signature wins were against guys that were coming up in weight. They were smaller guys naturally, and they are some of his signature wins. Whereas when you look at somebody like Gennady Golovkin, who beat a prime Kell Brook, who was one of the best welterweights in the world, it's almost used to criticize Golovkin, to dismiss the achievement. So we've managed somehow in the modern day to completely alter the perspective of fans as to how they actually analyze the fighters of today. And I actually think Floyd Mayweather played a big role in this, because he was so popular. He always spoke about, you know, being TBE and never taking an L. And that almost became the central narrative. And don't get me wrong, Floyd is an incredible fighter, but he was also very good at timing fights. He had a 6-fight deal with Showtime. He could have fought Canelo Alvarez in that 6th fight, because the later he fights him, the more Canelo grows. Instead, he fought him in the 2nd fight of the 6-fight deal, knowing he was still a little bit green. He's taking him on the way up. Then you look at him against Manny Pacquiao. Again, I believe Floyd probably would have beaten Pacquiao had it been earlier. Stylistically, I think he would have beaten him. But I don't know that for sure. When Manny was in his prime, he was throwing 1,000 punches a fight. By the time he came to fighting Floyd, the 3 fights leading up to that, he was averaging 600 punches a fight. That's a 40% reduction. For a guy whose volume is so important to him, that's significant. So Floyd was always aware of things like timing. And so instead of it being a point of criticism, people saw the success they had. We go back to the Kambosos example. Eddie Hearn said that Kambosos would have been entitled to have a homecoming fight against literally anybody, and nobody could have said anything to him. At the time, Eddie Hearn was the promoter of Devin Haney. So A lot of fighters are going to be looking at Kambosos and they're going to say, this was a warrior who went on the road, got to the very top of the sport, then could have had an easy fight at home, generated a lot of money, slowly built his legacy, started to say, who's Devin Haney for? Who's Tank Davis for? They want to shot at me, let them fight each other. That could have been his narrative. Instead, he didn't do that and look at the consequences. A lot of fighters are going to look at that and they're going to say, well, why should I take a risk? So a lot of the times, I think the narrative that we as fans create or accept can contribute to these things. And talking of narratives that fans push forward, at the moment, PED use and how rife it is in the sport is central to boxing. We're seeing it. We've all put videos up every single day. G-Man's done some great videos on them. I think I've done some pretty good ones too. Check them all out, guys, and let us know your opinions on these things. At the moment, one of the prevailing narratives is that if you fail a PED test, you should instantly be banned for life. No questions asked. This is a popular snowballing argument. But I want to pose something to you guys that I mentioned in my last video. If we go down that route, there are serious ramifications and consequences which a lot of people seem to be overlooking. Tyson Fury, Canelo Alvarez, Roy Jones Jr., Jarrell Miller, Conor Benn have all failed drugs tests. Floyd Mayweather never did, but Bob Arum, something I spoke about on my video that I did talking about Clomid and what it was as a drug, the first video I did on the topic, Bob Arum accused Floyd of having some adverse findings in his own tests when his testosterone levels came out. And a lot of people would have seen that as a real sign of something dodgy going on. A lot of people would have seen that as an adverse finding where there should have been consequences. Imagine all these names that I've mentioned to you were instantly banned for life. A lot of people will say, well, tough, that's how it should be. Billy Joe Saunders, all of them, get them out. But if that was to happen, you'd probably see the UFC pop up after a year and say, okay, you served your time. Everybody deserves a second chance. Come over to us. Go and train grappling. Go and train your legs. And if that was to happen, would we see almost like a brain drain effect, the complete absorption of the talent in boxing, moving over to MMA? And would we end up seeing the death of boxing? Or do you gentlemen believe that regardless, we need to stick by our sort of values and say, listen, fighter safety must come first. And regardless of the consequences, we have to potentially push through this idea of lifetime bans. Chris, I want to pose that question to you first.
Okay, so lifetime bans, I don't know how you would implement that from a legal standpoint, because you could argue from an employment standpoint, okay, there's something I've done wrong, and therefore I'm being punished for it, but you're effectively keeping me out of my job forever. And I think a good lawyer could pick a hole in that and take it to court and say, well, why are you banned, especially if it's a first warning, why are you banning for someone for first warning, and basically saying that they can't be employed in that field anymore. So that's one thing. In terms of drugs, personally, I think it should be 2 years. However, I do take your point about MMA and possibly being a brain drain, but you don't want a situation what's happened in other sports like cycling or athletics, especially in Tour de France, where every winner or everyone that comes close is very tainted by the drug use of, say, the past few decades. So I do, and also, yes, you do have fighter safety and whatnot and so on and so forth. One angle I want to open up as well in regards to the British Boxing Board of Control is, especially after what happened with Dillian White, I know that was UCAD, sorry, and not VADA, but I don't know why there's been these the guidelines regarding drug use has been a lot tighter, because it always seems, we all seem to hear about it after the A sample and before the B sample's been tested. So I'm not sure why the guidelines, especially what's happened over the last, say, 3 years, why those haven't been tightened, but that's another matter.
So what you're saying is that before we even start talking about bans, the first thing that needs to happen is if an A sample fails, you are suspended until a B sample comes out. In other words, it should be instant. None of this thing of let's wait and see if what the B sample says. We should look at it and tighten it in the sense that the moment there's something that suggests there's an adverse effect, it should automatically lead to a temporary suspension. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that the A sample should be tested, and then there should be, say, a 3 to 4 days limit before like the B sample's tested. At the moment, I think it was at the beginning of September that the Conor Benn was tested, the A sample tested positive, and we're still waiting for the B sample now.
What happens though if it's a late test, in the sense that, let's say your A sample shows positive on the Friday or the Thursday, 2 days before the fight? You know that you got the fight on Saturday. They tell you, right, it's going to take us 72 hours. That will take you beyond the point of the fight. Would you go ahead with the fight? Because there's a lot of talk about maybe that's what Matchroom tried to do. And I'm not making this allegation. I'm talking about the talks that they tried to delay the story coming out in the hope that the late notice would enable the fight to go ahead and then retrospectively to consider the B sample. In that scenario where it comes out late, would you want to see the suspension automatically applied until we then get the B sample to clarify?
I think in that situation, obviously if A sample is positive, then I would say at least the fight can't go ahead until the B sample is tested. I just think fighter safety is very important. And I understand there's a lot of money involved and promoters wouldn't like it as well. But I just feel that there needs to be a safety aspect to this. And I would say A sample comes out, that's not so much a previous suspension, but at least say stop the fight, see what happens, and then you can always rearrange it. And promoters don't necessarily have to reveal what happened in the A sample. Promoters are very good at diverting in that respect. So you could say, well, something's happened, maybe an injury or whatnot, and therefore the fight needs to be rearranged and then deal with it that way. But I just don't think you can have a situation where the B sample's not even been tested, and yet you're still going ahead with a fight. I just think for fighter safety, I think that's ridiculous, to be honest with you.
G-Man?
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm not in favour of lifetime bans. Again, I don't know how you'd ever enforce it for several different reasons. It's not just the fact that, you know, you could say, well, it's my first time, you're taking away my living. You know, I mean, boxing, there's no one major sanctioning body, there's no one major governing body. So, you know, you could pop in New York for something and the British Boxing Board of Control would say, well, we don't mind that. You're more than welcome to come over here. I think 2 years is right, because a year isn't enough. If you're a fighter who maybe has had a tough fight and is injured, you could be out for a year voluntarily. It's not really a ban if you're doing it voluntarily or something like that. So 2 years, 18 months to 2 years is perfect for me. It's the sweet spot. And if it's a situation, as Chris was saying there, where if there's an adverse finding in the A sample, I think that until we know the ins and outs, the fighter won't be necessarily suspended. But if they have a fight lined up or whatever like that, regardless of how far or how near we are to it, that fight should instantly get stopped. Maybe not the whole card. If the undercard can still go ahead, etc., that's fine. But the actual fight, as in fighter A and fighter B, if fighter A tests positive, gone, off. That fight's done until we know the ins and outs.
Well, gentlemen, we're reaching the end now. We've got 5 minutes left on this stream. So I want to thank you both for your participation. It's been a lovely chat. First of all, G-Man, can you tell us where everyone can find you? Not that anybody's going to have a problem finding you. Can you just introduce your channel to everyone?
In case you don't already know, it's G-Man Boxing. We do breaking news, reviews, fights, previews of fights, interviews, documentaries, a little bit of everything. I like to pride myself on being the breaking news on YouTube boxing. Whenever something comes out, even if I have to run out to a car and do a video, I'll try and get it out.
And Chris, can you tell us about your work, your book, where they can find The King of the Journeyman? Brilliant work, like I said, but also when you're hoping for your second work to be completed.
So in terms of King of the Journeyman, you can find it on most bookstores. So Amazon, will be on Amazon, it'll be on Waterstones as well. It's published by Pitch and it'll actually be on their website. There'll be a link in terms of how you can buy it. In regards to the second book, there's a lot of research to go into it. So I'm looking at either late 2023 or early 2024 regarding that. And that will actually involve me going to Ghana and interviewing people. So that I've got that lined up. In regards to my writing, I write for Fight Post, which their Twitter handle is UFC21, and they deal with not just boxing, but also UFC as well. And I also interview people, not just boxers, but also people outside of that, so writers, YouTubers, etc., etc. And my Twitter handle is eclecticchris42. So anyone who wants to talk to me about boxing can find me on Twitter with that handle.
And I will put a link to the book that you can buy from Chris. I'll also put a link to the interview that Chris carried out with me, so you can find his work on Fight Post there as well. From that, you can then go to the main website. I genuinely thank you guys for being here with me today. Thanks very much for joining us. Everybody, please leave your comments down below. Don't forget to hit the stiff jab onto that like button, the right cross onto the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching, everyone. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.